The year is 1514. Thomas More works as King Henry VIII's representative in Antwerp during trade negotiations with the government of Flanders. It's a very slow process since everything has to be approved by the king and his council, and mail travels by sea. During those long periods of boredom, More makes friends with his counterpart, Peter Giles, and they have long conversations about politics, philosophy, religion, and life in general. And those conversations inspire More to write a little book called Utopia, which he publishes in 1516. In it, More places fictional versions of himself and Giles in Antwerp, where Giles introduces him to a sailor who has recently returned from the New World. Raphael Hythloday claims to have spent 7 years in what he considers is the most perfect society ever devised by man. Of course, his friends are very interested, and he proceeds to tell them in great detail about the island of Utopia. 25 years later, More, now retired Lord Chancellor of England, has fallen out of favor with the king because he won't sign the document supporting Henry's assertion that he has more authority as a king than the Pope does. This doesn't go well for More, who is sentenced to death. Everyone, especially his beloved daughter, try to persuade him to compromise his principles, but he refuses. The night before his execution, his fictional friends Peter and Raphael come to visit, and they discuss how much better things might be in Europe if they were to adopt the utopian system of government. More implores them to return to Utopia and arrange for diplomatic relations. But it is not until he's kneeling before the executioner's block that they agree. He smiles as the axe falls, and 30 days later, while Margaret collects her father's severed head from the guards at London Bridge, Hythloday's ship sails with the tide toward the New World. Meanwhile, back in the New World, the Spanish are raising hell, raping native women, enslaving the men, murdering their children, and burning their villages to the ground. A clerk named Manuel, traveling with the conquistadors, protests and is beaten and left for dead. When he awakens, he hears a baby crying, and he rescues her from the smoldering village. He and a monk friend raise little Leonor in Havana and give her the best humanist education homeschooling can provide. She becomes an expert in the classic languages, science, philosophy, literature, and she even becomes an excellent archer. Growing up, Leonor divides her time between studying in the great mansion with her adopted uncle and Manuel's friend Bartolome, and engaging in conversation down by the river with a slave named Nohach. He teaches her about her native culture, and as she matures, she begins to grow quite fond of him. The women in the village are suspicious and advise the governor of this inappropriate relationship. Leonor's guardians learn that the governor has ordered Nohach to be arrested and executed for fraternization, and they decide to quickly send Leonor to Spain. But as the galley leaves the port, she learns of Nohach's fate. After attempting to jump overboard and swim ashore, she's confined to her quarters. She feels betrayed by the men who raised her and assumes the worst for her native friend. The ship sails into a great hurricane and is destroyed. Dolphins find her as she clings on a piece of wreckage, and they guide her makeshift raft to where Hythloday's crew can see her. A survivor, the watchman calls out, and Giles dives over the side and rescues her. She's cold, wet, and unconscious. Giles and the ship's doctor take her down to Raphael's cabin, remove her wet clothing, and cover her in blankets. After the storm, their ship is run aground on a reef, and nearby the Spanish galleon sits on the bottom of a small bay. There are no survivors except for the young woman. Corpses are strewn across the otherwise pristine beach, and gulls circle overhead, planning to feast on the flesh below. On board, Giles worries that she will not recover. Hythloday sits at his desk trying to determine how far off course they are. He suggests Giles get some air while he goes to the ship's laundry and retrieves the girl's dry clothing. Meanwhile, Leonor has been conscious for the whole time, and as Raphael leaves, she retrieves the sharp dividers that are on his desk. When Hythloday returns, the young woman springs to her feet and holds the dividers to Raphael's throat. Startled, he drops her dry clothing to the floor and attempts to convince her that she is in no danger, that she's among friends, and she slowly lets her guard down. The ship's tailor, who fancies himself a fashion designer, outfits her for what he envisions as appropriate clothing for a young woman's life at sea. Leonore, now disillusioned with the European culture in which she was raised, adopts her native name, Zwala, and refuses to talk about her background. Eventually, she agrees to act as the crew's translator and help them find Utopia. Giles and Hythloday have different opinions about Zwala. Giles doesn't trust her, but Hythloday is drawn to her in a sort of paternalistic relationship. They agree to put their trust in her abilities to negotiate with the indigenous people and to guide them to Utopia. Meanwhile, the crew remains behind with the ship to implement repairs and figure out how to free it from the reef where it languishes. Raphael's crew, incidentally, is comprised of disillusioned faculty from some of the great universities in Europe who have decided it's better to experience the world than to simply read about it. And so, Giles, Hythloday, and Zwala embark on a journey through the eastern Caribbean islands to the Orinoco Delta in South America, where Zwala has learned they will find the island of Utopia. On the way, they experience many different communities, each thinking theirs is the most perfect. But our explorers know that something is better just over the horizon.